Dust swirled around her ankles as Clara stood barefoot on the warped wooden boards of the auction block, clutching her baby so tightly to her chest that her knuckles ached with the effort not to tremble. The crowd below leaned forward in the sun, eager, unkind, their eyes crawling over her like flies over spoiled meat. But she stared straight ahead, face blank, jaw locked, praying the child wouldn't make a sound. Behind her, the auctioneer barked over the noise of horses and rusted metal and drunken laughter, calling her a healthy worker, decent-looking, could cook and clean, with a bonus thrown in for the baby if the buyer wasn't picky. She could feel sweat roll down her back beneath the worn dress, could smell the heat in the wool as the baby shifted slightly, his tiny head pressing into her collarbone, unaware of the terrible price being whispered around them. It hadn't been a choice. Nothing had been a choice since Elias died in the spring flood and left her with nothing but a debt too big to bury and a baby too small to beg. The ranch she'd been working on took her food, then her pride, then her freedom. And now she stood like livestock beside sacks of flour and broken saddles, pretending she didn't hear the men in the crowd joke about what a woman with a baby might be good for. One offered $1. Another laughed and said he'd bid if she lost the child. And Clara thought about stepping off the block and running until her feet bled. But even that wouldn't be freedom. Not in a town like this. She'd almost resigned herself to it when the auctioneer's voice faltered and a hush rippled through the crowd. Not loud, not panicked, but unmistakable, like wind before thunder. Clara followed their gaze and saw him standing at the back near the corral gates, tall, dust-covered, coat long and dark despite the heat, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face and hands wrapped tight around the reins of a black mare. He didn't speak, didn't move, just raised one finger and held it steady. The auctioneer frowned, unsure, until a silver coin arced through the air and landed with a heavy clink at his feet. Someone muttered that the man was mute, had been since the war, but rich enough to make folks ignore it. Clara watched as the auctioneer hesitated, then called it sold, and before she could react, the cowboy had already turned away, nodding once toward her without a word. The crowd parted as if something sacred had passed, and Clara stepped down from the block with the baby still sleeping against her, unsure if she'd just been rescued or sold into a quieter kind of ruin. The man didn't look back as Clara stumbled behind him, her arms still tight around the baby and her feet unsteady from hours of standing without water. And when he reached his horse, he simply reached out and took the small bundle from her arms without a word, cradling the infant as if he'd been expecting him, not purchasing a stranger's child at a public market. Clara hesitated, unsure if she should run, scream, thank him, or brace for the blow that might come next. But he only turned slightly and tilted his head toward the extra saddlebag on the mare, its flap already loosened, revealing a folded blanket and a biscuit wrapped in oilcloth, as though he'd come prepared to ride with more than just himself. The baby stirred but didn't cry, eyes fluttering open to blink up at the bearded man who watched him without expression. Clara climbed onto the horse behind him without speaking, not because she trusted him, but because in that moment she didn't know what else to do, and she had nothing left to lose. The townspeople barely acknowledged their exit, too stunned or too dismissive to protest, and by the time the horse's hooves left the last row of buildings behind, Clara could taste the metallic silence in her mouth, like a second tongue. The man rode like he'd done it forever, straight-backed, steady, no wasted movement, and for miles neither of them said a word. She studied his profile, the deep scar along his jaw, the way he flexed his gloved fingers occasionally like someone who remembered pain too well, and she wondered if the mute thing was real or chosen, a shield he could pull around him like the dust that cloaked their trail. Just before nightfall, they stopped by a dry creek bed, and without instruction, he built a fire, unrolled a blanket for her, then handed her back the baby and a worn canteen as if to say, "You're not a prisoner, you're just here." When she finally found her voice, she asked what his name was, but he simply shrugged and pointed to the sky, where a hawk circled overhead, then tapped his chest twice. Hawk, she guessed. Whether it was his name or what people called him, she didn't know, but it fit him somehow. Watchful, silent, lethal if pressed. As the fire crackled and the baby suckled against her chest, Clara stared across the flames at the man who'd bought her freedom for a coin and a glance, and she realized she'd never felt more afraid of safety in her life. Stood that Hawk wasn't taking her somewhere, he was taking her away from somewhere, and that difference mattered more than she'd thought at first. They avoided main roads and trading posts, cutting through cottonwood groves and riding creek beds until their boots stayed wet and their scent washed downstream. He didn't write, didn't gesture much, and yet somehow she always knew what he meant. When to stop, when to eat, when to duck low against the saddle as a rider passed too close. The baby, now more alert, gurgled when Hawk fed him bits of mashed potato and bounced him gently in one calloused hand, his thumb always brushing the child's cheek with the strange delicacy of a man afraid to break what he held. They camped in a hollowed ridge near dusk on the fourth day, and as the firelight danced across the walls, Clara watched Hawk oil the blade of his knife with the same tenderness he showed the baby, then slide it back into the sheath at his hip without ever glancing toward her. She wanted to ask who he was running from, what war had taken his voice and left him with coins to spare and silence to wield like a weapon. But the words felt like rocks in her mouth. Still, when she woke in the night to a noise, soft like humming, she froze. The baby lay warm beside her, and Hawk was at the edge of camp, half lit by moonlight, head bowed. He wasn't humming after all. He was breathing hard, almost shaking, one hand pressed to his chest as though something inside him was clawing to be let out. She didn't speak, only watched as he gritted his teeth and forced himself still again, his breathing slowing by inches. When he turned, she pretended to sleep, but he knew. His pause told her so. And when she woke again at dawn, there was a strip of jerky wrapped in cloth beside her, and a tiny, carved bird perched next to the baby's makeshift cradle. Hawk never looked at her while she packed it up, never demanded thanks, but that small bird sat heavy in her palm, like proof of something too private to name. Whatever had broken him hadn't made him cruel. It had made him careful. And Clara, for the first time since Elias drowned, felt the first faint stirring of a question more dangerous than fear. What if this man wasn't her captor, but the only person left alive who saw her as more than someone to survive? The road bent southward through pale hills and brittle brush, and Clara began to lose track of how many days they'd ridden, her body learning the rhythm of Hawk's silence, the way a songbird knows which branches bend. The baby grew stronger, more alert, his cries rare and his laughter soft. And though she tried not to hope, not to read meaning into comfort, it became harder to ignore the ease with which Hawk handed her the canteen first, or shifted the saddlebags so the child had more shade, or carved tiny shapes. Birds, a rabbit, a horse, when he thought she wasn't watching. She tried once more to ask him why he'd bought her, if it had been pity or penance. But he only shook his head slowly and touched the side of his throat with 2 fingers. She didn't press. She'd already guessed it wasn't just his voice that had been stolen, but something deeper. That night, under a canopy of stars too sharp to look at, she asked instead what his name had been before, if Hawk was what people called him, or what he called himself. He paused, staring into the fire for so long she thought he hadn't heard, but then he pulled a small piece of leather from his pocket and handed it to her. Burned into the rough hide were 5 letters, Jonah, faint but readable, the kind of thing a soldier might carry or a child might make. Her breath caught. Jonah. A name like a prayer swallowed by dust. She nodded, folded the leather, and handed it back, saying only, "Thank you," and meaning more than she could explain. From then on, she thought of him as both, the man who watched from the edge of firelight, and the name buried beneath silence. The next day, when they stopped at a riverbank to water the horses, a young ranch hand spotted them from across the stream. He was drunk, slurring something crude about women who rode with outlaws, and Clara's blood ran cold when the boy reached for the rifle strapped to his mule. But before she could move, Hawk, Jonah, had already stepped in front of her, a throwing knife in his hand so fast it blurred. He didn't throw it, only stood still, eyes locked with the ranch hand, daring him. The boy wavered, cursed, then spat into the dirt and rode off. When it was over, Jonah said nothing. He only turned back to her and gently touched the baby's blanket, then kept walking. Clara followed, not because she had to, but because for the first time since her world ended, she knew exactly where she wanted to be. They found the cabin in a narrow canyon split by a silver stream, half collapsed on one side but still standing. The roof bowed like an old man's shoulders, and smoke stains blackening the stone chimney from some fire long since gone. Jonah dismounted first, testing the porch with a cautious boot before lifting the baby into Clara's arms and nodding once, as if to say this would do. It wasn't much, but the walls held wind and the hearth still breathed when coaxed, and after so many nights of sleeping with rocks for pillows and fear as a blanket, Clara nearly wept at the sight of 4 crooked walls and a door she could bolt. They worked in silence for hours, hauling fallen branches from the woods, patching holes with pine sap and canvas. And when dusk settled, Jonah lit a fire that roared like it remembered the laughter that used to fill the space. Clara laid the baby on a thick layer of quilts she found in a locked chest, musty but warm, and stood watching Jonah as he carved another figure, this one a bear, with slow, deliberate movements. She asked him who the cabin had belonged to, if it was his, and he hesitated before pointing to himself, then holding up 3 fingers. 3 years, she guessed. Maybe since the war, maybe longer. He opened a small tin box and showed her a crumpled sketch of a woman with wild hair and eyes that looked like forgiveness. Clara didn't ask, but she knew. That kind of sketch only survived when the person didn't. She put her hand over his, not as comfort but as understanding, and he didn't pull away. The next morning she swept the cabin floor with a bundle of twigs tied by twine, and the dust rose like ghosts. Jonah chopped wood until the muscle in his jaw twitched, then took the baby to the creek and dipped the boy's feet in the cold water, watching him squirm and laugh, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls like a hymn. When Clara saw the 2 of them, one silent, one small, bathed in sunlight that cut through the cottonwoods like stained glass, she felt something crack inside her chest. Not pain, not grief. Something older. Something like mercy. And that night, as they sat in the doorway, the fire warming their backs and the moon silvering the trees, she said his name aloud for the first time. Jonah. And he looked at her like it was the only word he'd waited years to hear. They stayed hidden in the canyon, days folding into one another like linen on a shelf, soft and simple, until Clara forgot what it felt like to flinch at footsteps or measure her words for fear of being struck. Jonah rose before the sun, chopping wood, checking snares, leaving silent offerings at the edge of the creek. A fish laid gently on a stone, a carved horse for the baby, a bundle of wild onions. He never expected thanks, only watched Clara quietly, as if memorizing the way her hands moved when she fed the child, or how her braid fell forward when she read from the worn book she'd found in the chest. Once, when the baby cried through the night, Jonah took him without being asked, holding him against his chest until the little body went limp with sleep, and Clara sat across the room pretending not to cry as she watched the outlaw sway like a cradle. One afternoon, while Jonah was away gathering firewood, a stranger appeared on the ridge. A wiry man in a patched vest, rifle slung careless over his back, and a smirk curling his mouth. Clara froze where she stood by the garden bed Jonah had dug, placing her body between the stranger and the cabin door without thinking. The man tipped his hat, asked if she was the widow from Moss Bend, said he'd heard a woman and child were bought at auction by a mute outlaw. She said nothing, just gripped the wooden handle of the spade until splinters pressed into her palm. The man's smile widened, cruel and curious, and he said maybe she was worth finding after all. But then the baby cried, sharp and sudden, and the man's hand twitched toward his rifle until Jonah stepped from the trees like a shadow solidifying, axe still dripping sap, eyes dead calm. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just stood there until the stranger cursed, spat into the dirt, and backed away. When it was over, Clara turned to Jonah and whispered, "You're not just hiding, are you?" He shook his head once, then pointed to her, then the baby, then laid his hand flat over his heart. She understood. He wasn't running anymore. He was protecting something. That night, she sat closer to him than usual, shoulder brushing his, and when the baby reached for Jonah's hand in sleep, Clara didn't pull him back. Outside, wolves howled from the far ridge, but inside the cabin the silence felt less like fear and more like peace, finally learning to stay. The snows came early that year, blanketing the canyon in a hush so thick it felt like the world was holding its breath just for them. Clara wrapped the baby tighter each day, layering him in scraps of wool and tucking warm stones into the folds of his bedroll, and Jonah built up the fire until the walls of the cabin flickered gold with every heartbeat. They had fallen into a rhythm too natural to question. Jonah chopping, Clara stirring, the baby's laughter punctuating the stillness like a bell. But one morning, after Jonah returned from checking traps, he laid a single rabbit down and gestured toward the baby, then raised an eyebrow as if asking something. Clara stared at him, confused. He repeated the gesture, slower this time, touching the baby's chest, then tapping the cabin floor, then looking at her. Understanding dawned like light through frost. He wanted to know his name. The baby was nearing a year now, and had never been called anything but sweetheart or little one. Clara had avoided naming him the way people avoid planting flowers in borrowed soil. But now, in this place Jonah had made safe, with fire in the hearth and meat on the table, and someone who watched her son like a miracle instead of a burden, she felt something shift. That evening, while the snow whispered against the window and Jonah sat carving a new figure, a fox this time, sleek and clever, Clara said softly, "His name is Elias." After his father, Jonah paused, knife mid-air, then nodded once, reverently. She added, "But I reckon he's more yours than his now." Jonah blinked slowly, the corner of his mouth twitching into something not quite a smile, and he set the fox beside the sleeping boy like a blessing. Days passed, and Elias grew bolder, tottering between the chairs, clutching Jonah's pant leg with sticky fingers, giggling when the outlaw scooped him up and carried him on one shoulder like a sack of potatoes. Clara watched them with a tightness in her chest that wasn't pain but memory, of what she'd lost and what she'd found, tangled together so completely she no longer knew where grief ended and grace began. She'd stopped counting the days since the auction, Time had changed shape out here. It no longer measured survival. It measured belonging. And as she watched Jonah lift Elias high into the pale morning light, his strong hands steady and sure, she thought, this is what they tried to sell. And this is what they'll never touch again. The thaw came slowly, melting the edges of winter with cautious hands. And by the time the creek began to run freely again, Clara had almost convinced herself that the world had forgotten them. The cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like home. Elias had grown sturdier, walking now with a wobble and a purpose, his fists always clutching the latest animal Jonah carved for him. And Jonah himself seemed lighter, his silence less like a shield, and more like the kind of peace that didn't need explaining. Clara sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't name, 1 part sorrow, 2 parts something more tender. And she wondered if he knew how close she was to falling in love with someone who'd never spoken a word. But trouble, like weather, doesn't need permission to come. It showed up in the form of boot tracks, fresh ones, just outside the eastern ridge. Jonah saw them first and didn't hesitate. He packed their food, handed Clara the rifle, and pointed to the canyon's northern edge, his gestures calm but urgent. She didn't ask questions. That night, they didn't light a fire. Elias sensed the change and stayed quiet in Clara's arms, eyes wide. Before dawn, a man appeared near the creek, a rider in a pale coat with a badge at his chest and a shotgun slung low. He called out, saying he was looking for a woman and a child sold at auction, heard she'd run off with a mute outlaw who carved toys and carried guilt like a saddle. Clara's breath froze. She looked to Jonah, who was already gone from her side, flanking the trees with the knife at his belt. But before he acted, the rider tossed something toward the door, a small pouch. Inside was the same silver coin Jonah had used to buy them. The rider shouted, "I ain't here to drag her back. Just wanted to see the man who paid more than most men ever earn, for a broken woman and a babe not his." Then he turned and rode away. Jonah stepped from the woods, expression unreadable. He looked at the coin in Clara's hand and gently closed her fingers around it. Whatever that moment meant, it told her more than 1,000 words could have. He wasn't hiding from the world anymore. He was protecting the piece of it he'd claimed. That night, as the moon rose over the canyon, Clara lay awake, listening to Elias breathe between them, and whispered into the dark, "You didn't just buy us, Jonah. You saved us." And in the silence that followed, she swore she heard him breathe the words back. The days after the rider left felt quieter than before, not with fear, but with a knowing, like the earth itself had acknowledged them and passed no judgment. Clara noticed how Jonah moved with more stillness than usual, how he lingered longer near Elias when the boy napped, how his eyes held something he seemed afraid to release. She wanted to ask what haunted him still, but every time she tried, the words knotted in her throat. One evening, as the sun melted into the canyon and turned the creek gold, Jonah brought out a box Clara had never seen. Old and wrapped in leather, its corners worn. Inside were pieces of his past, fragments of maps, a military medal tarnished with time, a sketch of a church with its steeple broken, and a folded letter with a name she didn't recognize. He handed it to her, then stood and walked away. The letter was from a woman named Miriam, dated 5 years earlier, written in looping script that trembled near the end. It told of a child Jonah never met, one who didn't live long enough to know his father's voice, and how Miriam forgave him, even if he never forgave himself. Clara clutched the letter to her chest and felt something inside her shift, not from pity, but from awe. Jonah had carved toys for a boy he lost, then carved them again for a child he'd saved. He hadn't gone mute from injury. He'd gone quiet from grief. That night, she found him outside, sitting on the porch with Elias curled against his chest, both of them asleep under the stars. She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "You don't have to speak for me to hear you." He stirred, but didn't open his eyes. The next morning, as they packed for a trip into the valley for supplies, Jonah gestured to a patch of land beyond the cabin, pointing to the soil and then miming the shape of a house. Larger, sturdier. Clara blinked back tears. He wasn't planning to leave. He was planting roots. Later, as they rode towards the valley, Elias giggling on Jonah's shoulders, a wind picked up and carried the scent of wild sage through the air, and Clara thought of all the things Jonah had given her without ever opening his mouth. Safety, tenderness, a home. She reached for his hand, laced her fingers through his, and squeezed. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. She already knew what he would have said. Spring arrived like a breath held too long, and with it came the bloom of things Clara never thought she'd feel again. Safety, yes, but more than that, a quiet joy that settled over the cabin like morning mist. Jonah was still a man of silence, but in that silence now lived laughter, the kind that came soft and unexpected when Elias tumbled through the door chasing sunlight, or when Clara dropped a pan and Jonah raised a brow like it was the end of days. The garden they planted grew in crooked rows, wild and stubborn, but it fed them, and that was all that mattered. Every few days Jonah carved a new toy, more elaborate than the last, a bear whose paws moved, a wagon with tiny wheels, and each time he placed it on the edge of Elias's blanket, waiting until the child discovered it with squeals of wonder. But one morning, Clara found him carving something different. This one wasn't for Elias. It was smaller, older. A soldier, bent slightly at the knees, arms raised not in battle but in surrender. When she asked him about it, Jonah only nodded toward a corner shelf where a row of older, rougher toys sat untouched. The soldier joined them, quiet among the others. That afternoon, a rider came. Not a threat this time, but a messenger from the valley, a woman with kind eyes and a basket of eggs, who spoke of a new town being built 3 days east, where settlers needed hands and children would have a schoolhouse by summer. Clara listened politely, but her eyes never left Jonah, who stood just inside the cabin door, the baby in his arms, and a look on his face that she couldn't quite read. That night, after Elias slept and the stars pulled a blanket over the world, Jonah handed her a carved plaque. One word burned into it, ours. She held it like scripture, and without asking, hammered it above the door. In the morning, she found a wooden toy left on her pillow. Not an animal, not a soldier, but a woman with her arms outstretched, carved in the same posture she used to rock Elias to sleep. Jonah didn't need to say it. He never had. She stepped outside and saw him standing with Elias near the garden, hands stained with soil and eyes already lifted to meet hers. She walked toward them with the sun at her back, the cabin behind her, and the word ours casting a long shadow across the doorway, and in that moment she knew. They hadn't just survived. They had been chosen, gathered, stitched together by grief and grace, and no one could auction that away.